Scottish preacher. He says, not only has each person their individual relation to God, but each person has their peculiar relation to God. And what his point is that not only do we have a personal relationship with God, but that relationship is unique to us. And I think that when we think about the path that our lives will take, or the path that our lives have taken, I'm sure that the path that Eric's life has taken, or Ken's life has taken, is unique to Ken and Eric. The path that my life has taken is unique. You have a unique path. The important thing is figure out how to discover it. And I think that's discovered in relationship to our relationship with God. Okay, here's Steve Jobs. Now let me talk about Steve Jobs a second. Now Steve Jobs was asked to give a talk at Stanford. Now, Steve Jobs, someone mentioned that he's the, what was the term you used, I'm sorry, about Steve Jobs?
Me? I
Yes.
would say he was the best computer maker in the world.
Okay, great. Yeah, I had the chance of talking to Steve Wozniak, who was his partner at Apple early on. I think the mind of the entrepreneur is absolutely amazing. They just serially are creating things. Now, it's really kind of interesting. Do you know what one thing that both Steve Jobs and Bill Gates have in common? Anyone know? Just what?
They dropped out of college.
Absolutely. Jeff's got it. They dropped out of college. Absolutely. Isn't that amazing? These guys are two of the greatest entrepreneurs of the 20th century. Both dropped out of college. Let's think about that a second. Okay. That doesn't mean you should do that. I'm not suggesting it. But, so Steve Jobs got an interesting background. And when I read the story, I thought to myself, you know, there's a lot of learning here. I thought it was very, very moving, and I kept it. I said, I got to talk about this at some point. So now's my opportunity. He dropped out of college, and he was asked to give the commencement speech at Stanford, which is pretty high honor. And so he started his speech by saying, you know, he's adopted. So his mom gave him up for adoption, and one of the requirements that his mom had when he was adopted was that he would adopted by college-educated parents, because she wanted her son to go to college. Except that he was not adopted by college-educated parents. So the people who loved him and adopted him, they settled on this agreement whereby she would allow them to adopt him if they would guarantee that he would go to college. So that was the bargain. So he gets adopted, and so he's cruising through life. He gets to college. Now his parents were middle to lower middle class, really didn't have the money to send the kid to college. And he says he selected Reed College. Now Reed College is an interesting college. The interesting part of it is it's very expensive. And so halfway through his first semester, he dropped out of college. So he didn't drop out of college because he wasn't smart enough. He dropped out of college because he didn't want to make his adoptive parents pay the freight of 4 years of college. He just felt bad about that. But in that process, so I thought that was pretty noble. Most people wouldn't make that choice, but he did. In that process, he took a course in calligraphy. Now, calligraphy is writing, right? And that was sort of the course that really turned him on, calligraphy, right? And then he dropped out of college. So how could calligraphy have anything to do with success in life? And that's where he says, learn to connect the dots. And the point that he was making was that this was actually a pretty important issue, because one of the things that Apple computers have that is very different was their type fonts, which is kind of revolutionary at the time. They had unique fonts that no one else was able to replicate. That made it just kind of a cool computer to have. And it was that calligraphy. So he says from that, learn to connect the dots in your life. Even the small things in your life have particular importance, or can have the importance. He says, connect the dots in your life to something, and somehow those dots connect to important pieces in your future. He says, but in order to make the dots connect, his point, he's not a Christian. He says you've got to trust in something. He calls it destiny, karma. I think what he's talking about is God. I think what he's saying is learn to connect the dots in your life as a sign, as a path that points you to where God wants you to be in your life. So that's the first thing he says. In my life, it's interesting. Being in commercial litigation caused me to realize that I wanted to be on the front end of issues, not on the back end. I was involved in settling a lot of problems once there had been a dispute. I wanted to be part of the process of creating the transactions, not solving them once they had gone bad. For me, that's one dot that I connected. The second thing he talked about is learn from loss. Steve Jobs also has a very interesting history in that he founded Apple Computer. It became very, very successful. And then what happened? Anyone know the story? He was fired from his own company. Fired from his own company. You know, it's hard to imagine how embarrassing and humiliating that would be. You start your own business, you grow it to a significant size, and then you get fired from the business. That would be absolutely devastating to most of the people. You wouldn't learn anything. And you know, part of the issue here is, beyond connecting from the dots, learning from things that don't go wrong in your life. So what ended up happening, he said he swallowed his pride. He actually went to the people in Silicon Valley and apologized to them for letting them down. It's a pretty amazing humility. And then he started to rebuild his life. And then he created a company called Next that eventually was bought. Much of the technology was bought by Apple. And then he did what? What did he do next? What was his next company? Anyone know? It was Pixar, right. Toy Story. So, amazing person in that he created one of the most important computer companies, and then he creates Pixar. What he says about that is, your work will fill a large part of your life, and the only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is important work. At every point in his life, he somehow seemed to collect himself and then to figure out what was important and follow that. I'll tell you something, it's an amazing story. I think very few stories in American business like that have ever been written. So the point is, this is kind of tough to say because you haven't started, or maybe you're just thinking about starting. Failure is going to be a part of your life. Failure is not devastating. It's what you do with it. If you learn from it, it can be the doorway to another discovery. Sometimes you got to do something and not succeed to figure out what you ought to do. Sometimes that's the only path in life. So don't view failure as catastrophic, because the key thing here, the key part of the search, is finding and doing what you love doing. And then finally, if that story wasn't enough, he also had an amazing thing happen to him, which was that about a couple of years ago, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Now, pancreatic cancer is a pretty horrible disease, and it's particularly horrible because there's essentially no cure, and the diagnosis almost always results in death within 6 months. I've had, unfortunately, friends who've died of the disease. So he was presented the diagnosis, and then it appeared his life was over. So he had built 2 companies, all of this great work, and it looked like it was going to be all over. So he says, what did I learn from that? I learned that no matter how long I thought my life was going to last, it's finite. You only have a specific time in life to make your contribution in life. And I don't want to be morbid, because the last thing you want to hear about on a Friday afternoon is about death. But the point is, life does have its end. Now, in his case, what ended up happening was they did the diagnosis, and he had the rare type of pancreatic cancer